my goal, there's a couple goals here, because you've heard some really good speakers this morning that have given you some grounding in water law and Water Law 101. But one of my goals for this presentation is to allow you to have some examples and so on to take out so that your constituents and your clients can better understand what it is that you learned here today. Because when we hear about things like prior appropriation doctrine or relinquishment or first in time, first in right, what does that all mean? What does that mean to me on the ground? What does that mean to my constituents or my clients if I'm trying to sell real estate? What does it mean on the Olympic Peninsula? I also want to bring, as Catherine said, a public interest perspective, because that's what the Center for Environmental Law and Policy does. We do water law. We do litigation over water law, and I should tell you that I believe it was Ken Slattery who was talking about the litigation over the municipal water law. The Center for Environmental Law and Policy is one of the plaintiffs, so we are heavily involved in that, and we're trying to defend the public interest and get that law overturned. So I'd be happy to answer questions about that. But the things that are interesting about water law, and one of the things from the public interest point of view that's really important for me to try to get across to you from everything a public water lawyer does. And a public water lawyer doesn't have paying clients. We represent all of you, everybody in the public whose water it belongs to. And when I say that, I'm talking water law because water belongs to the public. All of the water belongs to all of us. And people who have a water right have a right to use the public's water, but they don't own the water. Now that's a tricky concept, and it's controversial, and people say, well, it's my water. No, it's your right to use water. So I want to give you some examples about that. Water in Washington belongs to the public and arguably the tribes, because it's co-managed. And individuals, they acquire a right of use. So this is similar to a license, okay? What's a right of use? Well, a ticket to a movie or a sporting event that entitles you to a seat. But do you own the seat? No. You have the right to use that seat for as long as the event is there, okay? A driver's license, that's a right to drive on the public highway. Do you own the highway? A lot of times we say, he's driving like he owns the highway. We don't like that, okay? No, we don't. Just because you have a driver's license doesn't mean you own the highway. But it does mean that you have a right to operate a vehicle on that highway. Fishing license, hunting license, gives you a right to fish or hunt and take animals that are essentially wild animals or in the public domain. That's another, like a right of use, like a water right. Here's one that's really pertinent because we're all getting hungry. Permission to go through a buffet line at a cafeteria. Okay, let's just say that, okay, you're allowed to go through the food line. You live in a dorm, it's lunchtime, I'm going through the line. Okay. You have the right to go through and to take what you need, but you don't own the food line. Okay? So those are the types of things that I am using, and I'm sure you can come up with a lot more examples of what is a right of use versus actually owning the quantity. So the water rights system is based on the fact that the public always owns the water, but that individuals can acquire a right of use to the water. So what's the value of your right of use? And as you've heard today, there's been a lot of emphasis on, well, the prior appropriation doctrine really has a lot to do with what a water right is value. But it also depends upon the availability and the reliability of the supply, because you've also heard that if a lot of people have water rights, many more water rights out there than what the river actually may have in it or the groundwater has in it, your right is only as good as your ability to go and actually get something. So if you have a right to go through a buffet line and everybody got there first and there's no more chicken, that's not a, it's a right. You might say, well, I have a right to go through, but it's not as valuable as if maybe the person got there first and got the chicken, okay? So it depends upon the availability and reliability of the supply, but it also very heavily depends on the individual's place in line. And it also, under our system of laws, depends upon whether the individual has consistently complied with the terms of the license to use, and it remains a license in good standing. And that touches on when we've talked about relinquishment. So again, I'm trying to give you some examples that you can use to take away from here today that you can say to somebody, well, what did you learn? Well, I learned that the water right is kind of like a driver's license. You have to comply with certain use of it, you have to renew it, otherwise you could lose it. Okay. So not the greatest analogy, but I'm hoping that helps some. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about this availability and the reliability of supply. A ticket to a Super Bowl, is that useful to you if you speculated and said, I know that the Seahawks are going to make it into the Super Bowl and I'm going to buy a ticket early, and oops, they don't make it through the playoffs. Is that ticket as valuable to you? No. What's a general admission ticket to a movie if you arrive late and all the good seats are gone? Or what if some of us arrived here a little late and we're sitting up in the balcony or something? We're here, but maybe it's not as good as Dave who's sitting in the front row. So it's relative to your place in line, definitely. And the prior appropriation doctrine, the first in time, first in right, is a very interesting kind of a doctrine, because your water right, assuming that you've complied with the terms of the license and it's consistently been used and all that, is much more valuable depending on how early a date that priority date has. And the reason why is because this is a really kind of a strange system, this prior appropriation system. It isn't based on necessarily equity or who has the most pressing need for the water. It literally is based on who got there first and who has been using the water to the extent that they have been placing it to beneficial use. So this is why, as Joe was saying, it is really kind of hard to take some 100-year-old laws or longer than 100-year-old laws and try to superimpose them on today's conditions when we do have global warming, we have scarcity, we have issues about that buffet line may not have all the food in it that we thought it did. And yet the system, the legal system that's superimposed on it says, no, our system says that whoever got there first gets to take all he or she wants. Doesn't matter if that means that the people at the end of the line get nothing. Tough, because everything is relative. Your water right is relative to everybody else. Now, here's another little example that maybe will help to explain this. Let's pretend that gasoline is allocated like water. That would mean that the people with the oldest gas-guzzling cars are entitled to drive up to the pump and get their tanks fully filled before anybody with a newer car that maybe have much more fuel-efficient car can get their gas. Okay. Now, once in a while, there's been gas shortages. I can remember even recently when the power was off and people weren't able to pump. What that would mean is that you'd look at that really long line and the guy with the 74 Chevy, station wagon is like, you get there first. Doesn't matter that, the mom driving the Prius with 3 kids that she needs to get to preschool or wherever, may have a greater need. This is how the prior appropriation system works. That person with the old car and the gas guzzler gets all of that allocation, and there it goes all the way down the line, and if the gasoline runs out, if you're on the junior end, you've got the 2005 Prius, you're out of luck. That affects the value of your water right, where your position in line. So somebody might say, well, that gas guzzler, that's a waste. That gas guzzler is wasting gas. Very important concept. Because also this comes to, when it comes to water law, as some of your other speakers have pointed out, you can't really waste it because that's against the law. So you can't just say, well, gee, I've got a water right. I had a water right. I was irrigating 50 acres. I really don't need to irrigate 50 acres, but I want to keep my water right, so I'm just going to turn on the tap and let it run as if I'm going to use that much, and it's just going to run, whatever. That would be illegal because you really need to be putting it to beneficial use without waste. But that's kind of a side concept. But it gets very tricky when it comes to, this other term of adjudication. What is it that a court will look at then if you've claimed that you had a water right prior to 1917, and they will look at how much have you actually beneficially used during all of those intervening years on a consistent basis. And that's what your water right will be at the end of the claim. Whatever the court determines is what you've actually put to beneficial use without waste on a continuous basis. So you need to kind of think about that as always being one of those things that the paper water right, so if somebody has a piece of paper that says a claim, I've got a claim for X amount, I've got a claim for 10, but really that person has only used 2, and when it comes time to actually prove how much has been used, the paper water right that says 10 is going to be judicially changed to 2. Okay. So that's another little issue about the water rights. Here's another example about what is the value of your water right and how does a priority date affect that. And this is going to take me back to Michigan State where I got my undergrad. And I'm a freshman, and in those days you got one trip through the cafeteria line, and I lived in one of those dorms that had, I think, 2,400 students. We were all crammed in there. And it was one of those things that if you wanted to get the good stuff, you kind of got there first because they'd run out of pie or they'd run out of something. But everybody in the dorm had a equal right to go through the cafeteria line. But on my second day in college, I was hired by the cafeteria staff to serve. And I was told, okay, you make sure that everybody gets one baked potato and one piece of meat and all this kind of stuff. This is what happens. So I was duly rationing out everybody's right, their water right to their lunch. And suddenly, and I'm kind of a tall person, but I found myself looking up, and someone said to me, I want 3 baked potatoes. It's like, I'm sorry, but I can only give you 1 baked potato. I want 3 baked potatoes. At which point, the person behind him, who turned out to be Duffy Doherty, said, give him the 3 baked potatoes, he's got a prior right. Well, it happened to be Bubba Smith. And I learned that the Michigan State football team ate in my dormitory in my particular line, and they were given a prior appropriation of being able to take as much as they wanted in food, and it wasn't, it was a superior water right, let's just put it that way. It's like, okay then, I learned about this appropriation system that when they say they want 3 baked potatoes, that's okay. But what that meant though is that probably the cafeteria staff was thinking, well, there's probably going to be some students that get here toward the end of the line that they might not get a baked potato. But that's kind of how that prior appropriation system works. So Bubba and the football team had definitely superior rights, and when they came through the line, they could take cuts in the line, and they got through. Okay. So what is the value of everybody else's food right or water right lived in that particular dorm? It was kind of colored by this senior right in the football team. And that's kind of how it works too with, as we've talked about federal reserved rights and we've talked about some of these other tribal rights and so on that are kind of out there that may not necessarily be asserted all the time, but if they are, they're going to get the baked potatoes, okay? Or they have a darn good legal claim to those baked potatoes. And so we always have to think of our own water rights in the back of our mind, like what happens if some superior right comes in and actually takes up a lot of the water, and then it pushes us kind of down the line further in terms of whether we get all of our own, okay? So how do we deal with relinquishment? Here's another one of these deals. That's a concept you've heard a lot about, and it's this use it or lose it doctrine. And it goes back to, if you can think of why there is relinquishment, there's a couple of reasons. One is, remember, water belongs to the public and it's supposed to be beneficially used because our government at the time that they adopted this prior appropriation system said we need to encourage people to come out here, we need to encourage them to use water to make this land productive. We're going to let them use the public's water, and we're going to encourage them to do that. And this is a good thing. Okay. But if you're not using it, is it fair to someone who comes after and wants that water? So think of the guy in the '74 Chevy who doesn't really need the full tank of gas, and maybe hasn't even come to the gas pump for 5 or 6 years, but suddenly there's, oh, I'm going to get my Chevy out of the barn and get my gas this time because I think there's a shortage and I want to get that. But if he hasn't put that gas to beneficial use for a long time, has it been fair to let him have it, to have that priority date? So that's how this use it or lose it concept comes about. One, because if water put to use is a good thing for society, it should be put to use and not hoarded, okay? But the second part about it is how increasingly it becomes difficult to manage a resource when you don't know when Bubba's coming through the line or when the guy's going to get his '74 Chevy out of the barn. You know? Because you can kind of get complacent and say, well, you know, there's enough baked potatoes here, no problem. But somebody who hasn't come through the line in 5 or 6 years and says, oh no, mine. You know, how do you plan for that? How do you figure out whether or not you can let other people come through the line? Junior users come through the line. So ecology has this kind of situation where they are the trustee of the public's water. They're supposed to be managing it in the public interest. And they have to figure out, well, how much is really there? How much is available physically, or how much is even legally available? Because there's always this kind of gray area, as Joe Mendel was saying. It's like, well, you know, there are some of these trump cards that can be played that are going to end up pushing people further in line. And ecology is trying to say, well, how can we manage this without raising expectations unnecessarily? Or how can we have people expect that they're going to be able to have water when actually climate change happens or the stream flow is too low and there are going to be some people that have a water right that aren't going to be able to use it? So it becomes increasingly difficult to manage a resource when there is this uncertainty about how much is there. Now here's another little commonplace example. It's a bank account. I like to think about water sometimes as a water budget. And think about it if it's a water bank account and you've written a lot of checks and you usually have this, you don't get around to balancing the checkbook and you just kind of take what the bank says is in the account and say, oh, looks like I've got, enough money to pay this bill. But then whammo, somebody's been holding a check for a while and they cash it and suddenly there wasn't enough money in the account. This is what happens in the water budget if ecology has made a mistake and says, okay, you can have a water right, but there are others out there that haven't been using their water rights for a while, and then they come back and say, oh, I'm going to start using now.
Sure.
Yeah. So I'm hoping that some of these examples will help you kind of understand the interrelationships between the concepts you've heard this morning and the fact that when you think of a framework, think of it as a public resource, that the Department of Ecology is the trustee of that resource, and they have to manage it for the public interest, for everybody in the public, and that it's very similar to many other things in life, where you're first in line, gives you the first in right, and that creating expectations depends very much on the reliability of the resource and whether the trustee that's managed it has managed to allocate in a way that makes sure everyone has enough. Because what's happening is, of course, increasing scarcity. I've brought some handouts for you, just some samples of things that the Center for Environmental Law and Policy has published over the years, some of our newsletters that kind of enumerates a little bit more about the public interest in water and some of the issues. But I will leave those out there and would invite you to take any of those if they interest you, and certainly I'd be very happy to take any questions or stick around.